Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PsillyPsyched podcast. And today I'm once again joined by my dad, James Phillips, and we're going to be talking about how to avoid bad trips.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you this morning. I think I would just add not only just how to avoid a bad trip, but once you're in one, how to get out of it.
Yeah, and what they are, just basically bad trips in general. Uh, have you ever had a bad trip before?
I have. I've had a few over time. I've had them on a couple of different things. I mean, back when I was very young, I had one that would have been considered a bad trip on ecstasy. I think they call it Molly, MDMA now. But I've also had one on acid LSD, and I've had a bad trip when it was on mushrooms. But I haven't had a lot. I've been around a lot of people over the years that have had them, so it is something I've seen and been from on the outside. And I've also helped people out of those negative places.
When you were in a bad trip experience, what would you describe it as?
I think the first thing for me personally is it felt like kind of the world was imploding on me, very much in my own self. I had an emotional bad trip where the people around me wanted to be very connected and close in one of my trips. And I just felt like I wanted to be left alone. And I kind of got to the place where I was just completely thinking about myself. And it was something that I was having trouble escaping. I also had a trip where I was using LSD, and on that one, it was more of a loss of control of the experience, and I was seeing things I didn't want to see. I was kind of worried about all the little things in my life that were going wrong, and it just seemed like the negativity got out of control.
I actually don't think I've ever heard about your negative LSD experience. I didn't know you had a negative Molly experience, but that's the first time I'm hearing about that. Uh, I'd say I've had very few bad experiences because I'm usually pretty level headed. The only experiences I say are bad was either someone else making the experience bad by, having a bad, like mood and kind of pulling me down a little bit. And even then, I still, like, kept myself level headed and happy because that's usually my mood when I'm doing, psychedelics. And then the only other bad experience was kind of just me making it bad by, kind of going in unhappy and then just not really allowing myself to be happier and chipper.
A lot of my friends when I was younger, if we would do something, any kind of psychedelic, they used to call me the bus driver. And one of the reasons they did that was because if we were all on a trip and tripping together, if somebody had a bad trip or would go into a place that was negative, a lot of times I would be able to get them out of that place. So they would like say that I would drive them out of the place that they were in. And you'll see a lot of this where now there's this idea of, psychedelic first responders or something, people that can help you out of that negative place. And there's a few things you can look at, when you're helping somebody come out of that negative narcissistic place inside of a psychedelic trip. And one of the things you've got to do is get them to basically see the world beyond themselves. You have to, a lot of times, get them to laugh. You have to get them to, whatever it is that they're obsessing on or they're circling back to over and over and over again. You've got to kind of shake them out of that and say, all right, hey, come out of this place.
Uh, what do you think puts people into bad trips?
Um, One, I mean, it can be just simply you're above your head in the amount of dosage you're using. So one of the things that happens a lot in the modern day is there's this idea that, of the five levels of basically ecstasy or the five levels that you experience on, whenever you do this on psychedelics, there's five different levels you can go to. And so a lot of times people will have never experienced a psychedelic before and somebody will give them a fifth level trip. And so not only are they having to experience the plant for the first time, or they have to experience the psychedelic experience for the first time, they're also having to deal with these high level thoughts and these high level experiences, and it's just too much. So a lot of times, one way to not have that kind of harsh inward narcissistic experience is maybe to start with a lower dosage and learn about what it is you're doing and get some experience in that psychedelic area.
I think as well. I've talked a lot on my channel about ascension and descension, and so one of the things that you have the choice of in life and in the spiritual world is ascending or descending. With ascending being reaching higher levels of good, and those are the feelings like happiness, goodness, and then there's descending, which is evil, darkness, depression. That's basically dissension. And so psychedelics allow you the opportunity sometimes to go into either one of those places fully. Whereas it sort of just puts it right in front of your face, and you can ascend or descend on psychedelics, which is why I think you have so many people who've had really horrible experiences and so many people who've had really amazing experiences.
Yeah, one of my friends years ago, and you've heard this, but I mean, one of my friends years ago did 200 straight days of LSD when he was probably about 19 years old. And after he was done, he quit talking. So, like, he never, after that, I don't know how I know his story because I can never remember talking to him about it. But I know that we knew the story, and it was something, and he was a sweet guy. But I mean, when you look at just that extreme of being in that place day in, day out, day in, day out, it really affected who he was. And I mean, we've talked before about dangers of this and dangers of that. But I think there was a kind of almost a disrespect for that place, that place that he was going to. And I can only imagine as he got deeper and deeper into that hole, it had to have been hard to come out of. And it had to, at some point, become this continuous bad trip. And he needed somebody to help him out. And truthfully, even be able to say, if you're having an experience where every time you're taking psychedelics, you're having a bad trip, you should probably stop doing psychedelics a little bit and look at what is going on that's causing you to have that relationship.
What would you say? Would you say there's a? I mean, I know what the answer is going to be, but for everybody else, there's a big difference between LSD and magic mushrooms and plants.
Yeah, I really think you have a different experience on mystical plants. I think for the most part, what happens with mystical plants is it's an organic thing that's more integrated into your body. It's more integrated into the way that you think. And I just don't think there's as many bad trips on the mystical plants. I think that processed things like LSD, MDMA, different kinds of psychedelics that are processed, I think they have a harsher kind of reality to them. It's not that they don't have benefit, but I think you're much more likely to have a bad trip when you're dealing with a processed type of psychedelic.
So, let's say you're by yourself. You've taken too much of whatever psychedelic, or maybe you weren't. It wasn't proper set and setting, and you feel like you're imploding on yourself, and the world's imploding on you. What would you say you have to do?
I think the first thing you've got to do is just realize that you still have what's called decision making, or in the spiritual world, we call it choice. And so you have the choice to say no to the experience. You literally, even if you're experiencing something, you have to realize that there is an integration between your mind and the spiritual when you're in that kind of psychedelic place. And if your mind is taking over and beginning to take over the experience, you have to tell yourself, I'm going to a place of goodness. This is all going to be over soon. I'm going to take myself out of this. And I think one of the things that a lot of people do on psychedelics that they need to be really careful of, and I guess I'm moving to that place, but you have to be very, very careful of cannabis. Cannabis is one of the most powerful psychedelics out there. And many times people don't realize that. But there's a shamanistic view of both tobacco, cannabis, those kinds of things that heighten the experience. They don't take it down and they don't mellow it. The cannabis or the tobacco will raise the experience to a higher level. And if you're in a bad trip, you should not be using cannabis because it also has that aspect of paranoia. So you can see if you layer on top of a psychedelic the cannabis, you're setting up a recipe to go to a place where your mind takes over the experience. And if you've got worries, or you've got things that are hurting you, or you've got emotional pain, whatever it is, that cannabis is going to take you into a dark space, and you're going to have to fight yourself out of it.
I would say that as well. I actually was glad you brought that up because when I talked about bad trips, I actually was not including cannabis because probably the real bad experiences I've had were always on cannabis, never on psychedelics. Uh, like just pure psychedelics. It was always with weed, and I also think weed works better with some people. Some people get really into weed because other people are into weed, and it's not their substance. It's not their plant, and so they end up just being really paranoid, or they end up having huge brain fog. And so I think you should pick plants that work for you, and not plants that are not helping you in your growth.
I think it goes with that too. I mean, one of the things is you have to realize we had talked about processed versus natural. I mean, there's a huge difference in cannabis between what a smoking leaf looks like, and even now, leaf from like the 70s was probably at 0.12%, as far as THC level, and now you can buy it at 33%. So you're dealing with something that's three times stronger. But then if you take that three times stronger cannabis and you turn it into an oil, now you've got this processed mega weed, mega cannabis. And so what you've got to be careful of is that stuff can make you hallucinate. I mean, you can actually have a full psychedelic experience if you start getting on like a vape pen that's got cannabis in it, and you just start hitting it really hard. I mean, it'll take you to levels that even the shrooms will, LSD will, everything else. And that may be what people are looking for, but it's going to be a mental high that is going to be a whole lot harder to control and filled with a lot more paranoia than you're going to have with, say, mushrooms or something on that more softer scale of psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're starting to go into a bad place on a heavy dose of shrooms, usually there's still a part of you that can be in control of your mind. But I think when people add huge amounts of weed to the psychedelic experience, then they start to lose control of the ability to even stop their mind from going into that place because the weed starts just driving them into that place.
Right, because you just described the ultimate bad trip. It's when you're in some kind of cycle of worry that you've got that keeps coming back around over and over and over again, and you're just like, I cannot get out of here. And the problem is, it goes back to choice, because then you have to, in that experience, it's hard to do sometimes, but you've got to gain the clarity of mind within a psychedelic experience to say, I refuse to do this cycle again. You have to come against that idea that whatever the worry is, or whatever the implosion is, that it's allowed to hit you a second time, because it kind of comes in waves. I mean, if you've ever been in a bad trip, it's a wave like experience. You'll be bad, you'll start raising up a little bit, and then it'll hit you again. You go back through the bad again, and what you have to do in that is when you come to that place where you're up, you're not in that place of crushing experience, that you then say enough of this, and you say, I'm going to think about something better. I know life is good. I know this trip is going to end. I know, and then it will slowly get you up out of there, and if you can even change a bad trip into a good trip.
And I think one of the things as well is LSD is all about warped reality, loops. There's tons of loops people talk about. And so the worst that could happen is looping negativity. And, on psychedelic, you see infinites. So going into a place where you're feeling the infinite negativity in the world, you want to be feeling the infinite positive feelings. And so it's really all about just and the thing is, because you're God, you have control over whatever you experience, even in the physical world. And so in the spiritual world, and when you're on psychedelics, you just have to take control and guide yourself.
Well, it's true. I mean, I've had experiences in my life which I would call a bad trip, but I wasn't on anything. So you can have that same mental looping where you're worried about something or something. We've all experienced it. Called anxiety, depression, panic. Panic attack, and all that. And so all those same things of anxiety, depression, panic attacks, the PTSD, all of those things can show up in a spiritual world too, because if you haven't dealt with it on the physical plane, it's not going to go away just because you're on mushrooms or whatever. You might be working through it on those levels, but be aware that if you have that problem in your everyday life, that you need to be working on it on that level too, because you could find yourself in a spiritual place where you're face to face with it.
And if you're a lot of times with substances, they want to correct you, as well. So if you're on shrooms and they're trying to correct you, and you're becoming just completely narcissistic on it, you refuse to take correction, then I think it that's when you kind of start having bad experiences as well. If you refuse to listen to what you're being told.
Agreed. And I think that, like when we talked initially, like whenever I've been the first responder, right? One of the things, or the bus driver, to get somebody out of a place, that is the first thing that you do with them, is you try to connect to them and get them to come out with you, and to be able to go back to a place where they feel like they're in control, because it's the idea that they're enslaved somehow by the experience that is really tearing them up.
Weirdly enough, I wanted to mention that I see the evil faces sometimes if I'm on, a high dose. I'll see things that are kind of scary. I always see kind of like creepy smiley faces a lot too, which is weird. But none of it seems to scare me. I never get scared of visuals really. The things that might cause me a little like ooh is just feeling, especially with like come ups. If I'm getting my heart starts beating really fast, and I have a ton of psilocybin entering my system, then the feeling can get a little bit overwhelming, not the actual visuals themselves. And I think a lot of people would say on bad trips is even more of the feeling than what you're seeing.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my worst experience, like I said, you'd be surprised. Worst bad experience I ever had was on ecstasy. I felt like it was the feelings that were overwhelming. It wasn't any visual that got me. It was the fact that everything felt desperate to me. Everything felt out of control. Everybody around me seemed to be, wanting me for whatever reason. Like, it was too much for me to handle at that point. I was young too. And so, would I have that experience now? I don't think I would. I don't think I could have that experience now. But some of it went back to who I was at the time. And then to get myself out of that place, honestly, I had to get away from the people I was around. I had to say, I don't want this. I'm leaving. I need to change my environment. And by changing my environment that day, I went on to have a good final place that I went to in that. But the initial was horrible. But then by changing my environment, changing who I was with, I was able to get myself out of that place.
And that actually leads me to, I think, another thing I want to mention, which is because this is closer to something I've experienced, and it sounds like you've experienced, which is when it's not you who's pulling your trip down, it's the people around you. Because there are situations where, maybe you've picked somebody to do it with, to do a psychedelic with, and then either they start imploding, which is pulling you down, or they go into some weird place. Because there does exist in the spiritual world a really weird point in consciousness, I'd say, which is the dissension. And then I mean there's even people who enjoy negativity on psychedelics. Those kinds of people exist, and you see this sometimes with Satanists, or people who are
Uh,
taking psychedelics and like the negativity. So if you're getting driven into the negative, what would you say to do? Is we've talked about it before.
Well, I think it's interesting you're talking about this because we were actually talking about this yesterday. We were talking to a group of people that are doing ayahuasca, and there's all these different places in Chicago that are doing these ayahuasca. There's so many people showing up because everybody wants to do ayahuasca. The people that are making the brew are making money off of it, so they're like, "Come on and see us," but they're not giving you any kind of like interaction or anything. They're not giving you any kind of teaching. But apparently, there's people that are showing up that are like neo Nazis, or they believe they're witches or Satanists or whatever it is, who are literally showing up to these meetings and trying to project negativity on the people around them because that's their downward trip that they're into. And so, you have to be aware of the group you're with, because one of the things that with the groups that I'm with and the groups that I'm dealing with, there's always somebody that's sober with that group. So you can really know that, look, I'm going to be with the group, but we're going to leave this one protective person behind, kind of like the designated bus driver, right? I mean, you're picking that person that's going to be, if somebody goes bad, that you can talk to somebody that's going to bring you back from that spiritual place, back to a place of warmth, health, kind of reset you, and you can go back into your trip. But I mean, I've, especially with the ayahuasca trips now and the groups that are out there, I've been in a couple of these different circles, and you'll see people have a really bad trip and they're just by themselves, and like the way it's designated, they're being forced to do the trip by themselves, and there's not really anybody to talk them through. But sometimes it's just nice to be able to talk out of the place you're at.
And like we talked about choice, and I think that applies if you're having a bad experience by yourself or if someone else is driving you into a bad place. You have to just say to it, I'm not going to this place with you. We talked about like I'm not going lower with you. I'm not descending with you. I'm going to ascend, and you're either gonna, you're either gonna come with me to the ascension, or you're just gonna be in your weird place, and I'm gonna stay away from you, or I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do my thing, but I'm not going into whatever weird spiral you're trying to send me down.
Agreed. Yeah, you got to be careful with those you do this with.
And I'm trying to think of any other things to maybe add. Are there any other thoughts?
I think the only other kind of place that I would go with this is that when you begin your trip, whatever the psychedelic trip you begin with, you probably ought to know what you're doing. And what I mean by that is, like, most people these days are approaching it as like, oh, I'm just going to have some fun. But you have to realize you're dealing with a really powerful spiritual force. And if you approach it lightly, if you approach it as though it's not a type of sacrament, if you approach it as though it's not something that's holy and going to open a door for you to a spiritual plane, you're setting yourself up to go to a place where you're suddenly surprised by what happens to you. And I personally don't like to do it that way. I like to, whether you believe in prayer, whether you believe in speech, whatever it is you believe in, I think you should really know what the experience is going to be and what your expectation is of your psychedelic experience. And if you've never done it before, do a lower dose. If you've done it before and you've done a third level experience and you're going higher, say, okay, I know that this is going to be a boundary breaking experience, and be ready for that. Don't decide, oh, I'm going to get high on some cannabis, or I'm going to drink while I do this, or I'm going to disrespect what I'm doing, because some of this is about respecting the experience itself. And if you get caught in that place and you haven't respected it, it'll disrespect you.
That I think that is one of the worst things you can do is just disrespect it. Be like just doing something, drinking a lot, and then being like, oh, we'll take a ton of shrooms to party with, and then suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you're having a terrible experience, and that also led me back to another thing which I wanted to say, which is always, you always want to return to the place, that ruach, that physical level, and so at the end of every trip, you have to know, okay, I'm going to now return to the physical world. I'm now going to return to this plane, the I want to say normal plane of thinking.
Yeah, I think, and remember that there are things that can happen to you while you're on a psychedelic trip. And one of the things a lot of people don't realize, and probably this should be earlier in the podcast than it is later, but the problem is there is a thing that you have that holds your spiritual light. It's a type of body shell, a spiritual body. And when you go to those places, you're interacting with the spiritual light at those higher levels. And so, what becomes really important to know, rather than me tell you what that experience is like, is that if you do too much of a psychedelic experience at a higher level than you are ready for, it almost cracks your shell. And what that means is it makes it so you can do a huge psychedelic experience and have a bad trip or a good trip or whatever. But the next day when you're recovering, you just don't feel right. And that could happen. It could be a week later that you're still experiencing that, shamanistic experience that you went through. But what happened is you did too much, and it's going to take you several weeks or a month or even maybe 3 months to recover from that experience because you're processing all that spirituality that you went through and that you experienced. The reason this is important is because if you have that feeling where you're kind of drained of energy, that is not a good time to go back and do more psychedelics. That's a time of healing where you're building up that spiritual body for the next time you do it. So sometimes if you feel like, look, I really don't feel like I can do these right now, and somebody's pressuring you, well, you just did them last night, let's do them again. You know, follow that intuition. If you don't feel 100%, that is not a time to do that because that's when you're going to have that negative and downward spiral experience because you're not going to have the strength to deal with it.
Also, I feel like I should mention, because this is another thing that's becoming people will recommend this to you, taking or having with you just for reassurance some sort of benzo, which is like Xanax. There's certain, you can get them from doctors usually for like anxiety and that kind of thing. Having just having like Xanax or something, because what it does is it can actually, they call them trip killers, because it can end pretty much whatever experience you're in. If you take it, it'll usually kind of either much lessen or completely end the experience. And so I've actually read about people having, the horrible experiences taking a benzo, and then it just ends it. So it's probably good to have something like that for if you go into if you're someone who can go into complete hysteria, there's no getting yourself out of this, you're just descending, just take one and
Yeah,
end the experience.
you might want to look at that for sure because, like with cannabis, the way to end a cannabis trip, the paranoid cannabis trip, is to use lemon. So, like a lot of people don't realize that the reason you have lemon in your water is because it comes from an Arabic tradition where people were getting high on hash and then they would want to eat and then not be as high while they're eating. So they put lemon in their water. But there's a reason for that. It's supposed to take everybody's trip down. And so there are other things like that are out there, but there's counter things too. So if you're having a bad trip and you decide that you're going to put sugar in your body, get ready because it's going to go the other way. Sugar expands almost every psychedelic trip, makes it bigger.
Yeah, so just know what you're doing, research. Uh, if you need to if it'll make you feel better to have preparations for if it goes wrong, get those preparations in order. And remember, you can always take less, but you can never take more. Or, sorry, you can always take more, but you can never take less.
That may be the
wrong point to end
could be the other point. The other side of taking your experience and extending it.
You can always take more. You can never take. God. Yeah. You can always take more. You can never take less. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's probably the way we should end.
So just be safe, be smart, and you have control over your experience. And so don't let yourself go into that negative place. If you are, there are ways to get out of it. And we're going to see you guys on the next Silly Psyched podcast.
Have a great one.
Bye-bye.